Okay, there we go. We're all getting used to. So, back to the presentation. So what I'm going to do today is we've been doing quite a bit of research at Abacus, looking at how Canadians are responding and reacting to the events we're all living through and the things that, I'm just going to see here. Thank you for all the feedback, everybody, on my haircut. What we're living through in terms of the impact of this pandemic on us as individuals, as employees, as workers, as citizens, and as consumers. And so what I'm going to do is take you through some of that research. We just finished our third survey literally today, and we launched that on Sunday. So I've got some brand new data to share as part of this. And really, for me, there's a really interesting story emerging in terms of the shifting views of Canadians in a very short period of time. But I want to start the conversation today by really thinking about where we are. And there's lots of hypotheses, lots of models out there describing the phases of this crisis. And in my mind, looking at public opinion data and my own experiences, I feel like we've entered phase 2 in the last few days. When this first started, just over 6 weeks ago, March 16th was the first day I started working from home, and my whole team started working from home. I think we were all reacting to something that came along pretty quickly, something we saw happening in other parts of the world, but soon our lives were turned upside down where we were working, if we were working at all. For many Canadians, they were out of work fairly quickly. If we have children, how we were going to educate them, how we were going to take care of them at the same time that if we had to work remotely, how we were going to do all that. Many of us rushing to grocery stores and other retailers to stock up on food and household goods. This was the moment where there was so much uncertainty and fear about how bad would it get in Canada and whether or not we would be able to flatten the curve, and governments ramping up restrictions on what we could and couldn't do. I think we've now hit a phase where most of that deep fear, that fear driven by uncertainty around the virus itself and how fast it would spread, has shifted into one where more of us are now coping with this new reality, right? We haven't been, governments haven't lifted many of the restrictions that were in place. And as a result, we've entered, excuse me, phase 2 of this, which I call the coping phase. Once we start to see the economy reopen a little bit, once we start to see some of these restrictions move, I think we enter phase 3, which I'm calling the reset phase. And that's really about understanding. And I think one of the big questions I ask, regardless of what sector you're in terms of cooperatives and mutuals, is the difference between what we're allowed to do and what people feel comfortable doing, in my mind, is the big key question going forward. And that's going to be that period between when we have this freedom and when a vaccine is found for the virus, or an effective treatment. Once that's found, we'll enter this new normal period in the final phase of this. So I'm really focused now on phase 2 and 3, because I think we don't know how long these are going to last, but we do expect them to be longer than maybe we first thought. One of the things we're talking a lot about is what's going to change, right? You've heard anywhere from prognosticators saying that everything is going to change, our lives are going to be fundamentally different after this, to people saying, well, nothing really is going to change. I think my perspective is, and what I'm seeing from the data is, I think some things will change. I think it's hard to not conclude that, new habits will form over the periods that we are stuck at home and doing things in very different ways. People say, research suggests that 21 days it takes to form new habits, and we've been doing this now for well over 21 days, that something is going to have to change as a result. And so understanding what's changing, why it's changing, and how, as businesses, as organizations, as an entire sector, can react and respond to that, is what I'm going to try to give you some insight into today. It appears to me, though, that at the very least, a number of the trends and shifts that we have seen before COVID became a real crisis are likely going to accelerate. So the shift to more digital first economy, we had seen it particularly with younger consumers, younger Canadians, a desire to see most interactions, most communication, the way they work was very digitally based. I think that has accelerated in a world where we are looking for touchless solutions to many of our day-to-day interactions. We've seen the rise, obviously, of flexible work before COVID that has accelerated to now where if you are able to work from home, we are, I think, increasingly realizing while we may not love it and we may not want to do it every day, that many organizations and leaders of organizations I've spoke to have come to realize that it is possible to be productive and to run not just a small business from your home, but increasingly a multinational or certainly a large business from multiple homes across the country. And that home-based tendency that we had seen before COVID now has been formalized, certainly during this period. And so much of our life is based here. And so we're entertaining ourselves, we're learning, we're working, we're communicating, we're connecting. All of that now is coming out of our home. And so the value of our home and the role that our homes play, I think, will also accelerate and shift from some of the trends we see. Finally, I'm going to speak a little bit today about the role that government's playing in our lives. Another announcement today from the Prime Minister, support for students across the country. We had seen some shifts in public attitudes around, support for deficits, the role that governments are playing. I'm going to share some data that shows significant shifts in very short periods of time around how people are feeling about the role of government that I think has some implications for how cooperatives and mutuals should be thinking about their role in the economy. But in my mind, there's two big questions that I'm going to try to start answering for you. And I don't have all the answers, and I don't think anyone who says they do is being truthful with you right now. But to my mind, it's what will this new normal be once we hit phase 4 of this process and we have a vaccine and we are free to live our lives more or less the way we'd like to? What does that world look like? What's been the impact both economically, socially, from a mental health and a physical health perspective? And as organizational leaders, whether we're leading a team, whether you're leading an entire organization, what's the right bet to make going forward? And I think there is a valuable role for research in helping to clarify this, because in my mind, a lot has changed in terms of how people make decisions. And so we almost have to throw out past assumptions and start relearning some of the things we just assumed were the case that may not be the case anymore. And if you think about it, within a month and a half, that's happened. And so that to me is how you make the best bet. So let me dive into some of the findings we see in the research. And you may have seen some of this, you may be feeling this yourself, some of this is not going to be that surprising. And the first one is that most Canadians say they are following this story and news about COVID very closely. I've never seen a level of engagement on this issue as I have seen over the last 6 weeks. 77% in our most recent survey say they're following this closely, and that's across all age groups, it's across the country, and it's persistent, right? The number is holding steady, meaning there's nothing else to talk about, there's nothing else to watch. Unfortunately, the tragedy in Nova Scotia, took our attention away from our own lives, and we felt empathy for a completely different tragedy over the weekend. But, we will come back to focusing on COVID because it has completely engulfed our lives, I think, going forward. When we look at some other data, in a recent survey, 2/3 of Canadians say they're watching Canadian TV news at least once a day. We've never seen numbers like that over the last few years. As more and more people get their news and information from different sources, the fact that you could actually find one source bringing so many people together and so often was quite rare. And so there is this tendency right now to be paying attention. And so the point is, all organizations have high stakes in this kind of environment, that people are paying attention, they're watching. And so what you do today, what you do during a crisis that people are paying firsthand attention to can have lasting effects on your reputation going forward. We also have seen a shift in how people are feeling about COVID-19. We had seen a ramp up from early February about the percentage of Canadians who were most worried, those saying they are extremely worried or worried a lot about the pandemic. And it basically seems to have peaked about 2 weeks ago. Our last survey, April 7th, we saw 41% of Canadians saying they are extremely or somewhat worried. Very small minority of Canadians are not worried at all. There are some, but it's still very small. But what we've seen is that curve start to turn. And in our most recent survey that we finished yesterday, 34% now say they're very concerned. And so that, to me, is the signal we are moving into a new phase of this crisis, of this process. And Canadians are still concerned. They're still thinking about the future. They're trying to figure out the implications for themselves, their family, for the communities they live in. But they're less, I think, intensely worried about whether our health system is going to be able to handle a high peak, whether we're going to be able to flatten the curve, whether our leaders are more responsible perhaps than others around the world. And we can look down to the south in the US for an easy comparison. But there's still deep emotional and mental health concerns out there. 65% of Canadians told me in a survey we did that last week they felt anxious because of COVID-19. 43% reported being lonely as a result. And you can see the differences by age group. Younger Canadians in particular are reporting much higher incidence of feeling lonely. And I think a lot of that at first had to do with a crazy disruption in our lives, being isolated from people we love, that people we're used to interacting with, particularly for people who live in single person households. They're all alone. And over time, we've found ways of coping and responding to that. But the new uncertainty about how long this is going to go, and for many more, the economic impact of this, I think is creating new levels of anxiety. Just as an example, when we ask people, have you lost sleep as a result of COVID? We find about 35% of Canadians say yes, but you can see a big gap between men and women. This difference in terms of the level of concern about the reported mental health effects of this crisis in the pandemic has been persistent across gender. It's the one variable that seems to predict so much more of what's going on today than anything else. Age to some extent, but gender seems to be the biggest predictor. We see it as well when we ask people, are you starting to avoid news around COVID because of the impact that it's having on you? And you can see that a sizable number of Canadians overall are doing it. I myself have a rule. I try not to look at Twitter or any social media after 8 o'clock. I won't watch any news, after dinner, because I find makes me harder, having a harder time to fall asleep. And I think many Canadians are feeling the same way, and that's what our research is showing. Now, one of the reasons initially why people were quite worried about this was many Canadians thought it was likely that they or somebody they knew might actually contract the virus. And that number hasn't really changed over the last 5 weeks. It spiked very quickly in March, and it's basically held around half of Canadians believe that they or somebody they know will get this. It's down slightly. And as more and more stories come out about our ability to control this, and I think that will start to soften. And as perceptions shift, and this is a really important factor in my view, is people's concern about this shift, as their perceptions about whether it's going to get worse or not, and I'll show you data in a moment, that's going to change their expectations about what they should be able and what they should not be able to do, and what they want government in particular to allow us to do going forward. Moving ahead, this is a question we've seen big changes on. We asked people throughout our surveys, do you feel the worst is still to come around this pandemic, the worst is behind us, or you're not sure at this point? And you can see in 2 weeks, we rarely see these kinds of shifts in any kind of surveys we do, like significant, massive shifts, to the point where still more people think the worst is still to come than think the worst is behind us. But I think we're starting to get to a point where more and more Canadians are looking ahead and saying, okay, I think we've crested this. I think the peak of at least hopefully this first wave of infections are slowing, and we can now maybe pivot ahead and start thinking about recovery as opposed to reaction. We're not quite there yet. You can see far more people now have piled into that I'm not sure, but that lack of certainty about the worst coming will affect people's behavior. You're likely going to see less stockpiling, less, buying canned foods and paper products at retailers. You're going to see a little bit more openness and thinking about how do I return more to my normal life going forward. But that being said, there's still a broad perception that this is still a long game, a long process before we get to normal. When we ask people, how long do you think it will be before you get to live your life more or less as you have been? You can see that a majority of the country, 16 plus 38, gets you over 50, are saying it's going to take at least 4 months or more before that normal period will return. And we've seen over time that people have increasingly become having a longer time horizon, as government and public health officials tell us that we are not going to just simply be able to flip a switch and everything gets back to normal, that this is going to be a process of opening the economy back up, of letting people out of their homes and interacting in ways until a vaccine's found. That new normal will not be here overnight, and people expect it. Now, not surprising, and you've seen other data, I'm sure, about this, and you're experiencing it yourself. People are changed overwhelmingly because we're stuck at home, the things we're doing. So we are far less likely, most of us, to be interacting with other people, to be driving a car, to be even getting exercise. 40% of those who do it regularly say they're doing less of it. But we are spending more time on our phones. We're watching more video content. We're going to release some data later this week that we did with a telecom company that shows huge spike in use of the internet, and use of the internet in ways maybe many of us didn't think we would regularly do, playing video games, right? So we're trying to keep ourselves busy. We're trying to keep ourselves occupied. And to some, a sense of boredom now is setting in. I live in Ottawa. The weather hasn't been all that great the last few days, so it's even hard to go out. And if you have a lawn or a piece of property or a garden to do something, it snowed this morning and it was -6 here. So the weather, depending on where you live in the country, I know in Alberta right now it's super warm, has also, I think, played a factor in getting people out. And even though we can't congregate together and we can't go to parks and we can't be together, being stuck at home, I think, has had a big effect. Now, the second factor, which is undoubtedly probably makes this even more unprecedented, is going to be the financial impact that this is having on Canadians. And the scale of the reported numbers are substantial and something I've never seen before. When we ask people, how much harm has the pandemic had on your personal financial situation? We've seen a slight decreasing of the intensity of this number. I think as government aid starts flowing, people are feeling a little better, at least in the short term. But still, 38% of Canadians say this pandemic has had a great deal of harm or a moderate amount of harm on their finances already. And so that's a huge number of Canadians who are feeling the financial impact. For a big portion of the country, on the other hand, while they've been disrupted in terms of their lifestyle, maybe in terms of how they work, there's a lot who haven't been financially impacted. And so the gap between those who have a job and a stable source of income and those who don't has widened in a very short period of time. And I think one of the big public policy challenges we're going to have over the next year to 18 months is trying to close that gap and make sure it doesn't grow bigger, that this doesn't become a moment that separates generations or separates people who work in certain sectors and were completely disrupted by it versus those that didn't really feel much financial impact. And from our own survey, we see the evidence of this. We see it in terms of the number of people who've applied for the federal government's package, which I think now has reached over 6 million. But at the time we did this survey in early April, 14% had said they had been laid off or furloughed because of COVID-19. Another 1 out of 5 say they're working or doing schooling at the time remotely. So a huge shift in how, as a country, we're working or not, how we're working, where we're working. And just to give you a sense of the 4.2 million people at the time that said they were laid off, only 61% had savings of $2,500 or less that they could access. And they had lost pretty much all of their regular income. And so we have the group that's most vulnerable, the group that's most insecure or precarious or in a precarious position were the most impacted by this. And the evidence in our surveys and others is pretty stark. And so not surprising, the long-term financial implications, half of the country say they're worried about that. That's more than those that say they've been impacted in the short term. But for many others, they're thinking longer term, their ability to buy a home, their ability to retire, their ability to achieve many of the goals that they had set for themselves. If you're a student about to graduate into this environment, very different today in terms of your headspace than you were just a few weeks back when I was teaching still at Carleton. You know, the world has fundamentally changed in a very short period of time. Many Canadians worried about paying their day-to-day bills, and even a quarter of the country, even as late as this week, are saying they're still worried that their job will disappear, that the temporary layoff that they may have experienced may become permanent. And that deep fear and the economic deterioration that I think we're seeing across the country remains the area where people are just not clear about how big of an impact this is going to have going forward. Now, I think one of the things we do at times of distress, of vulnerability, is seek comfort from government and from our political leaders. And I do think the data that we have suggests that Canadians have felt quite good about the response we've seen at all levels of government. When we ask about the federal government, for example, and how well it has performed or handled the coronavirus situation, this is the percentage over the 3 waves of research who say they have done it, they've done well, or well as can be expected, right? So generally positive impressions. The numbers have stayed pretty static across the board. When we asked specifically about the federal aid package that came out just in early April, you can see that, you know, most people felt it was appropriate. Very few thought the government went too far. And there was a sizable group, 1 out of 5, who said they haven't gone far enough, that more needed to be done. And so here's evidence again that government has the license, social license, to continue to intervene, to continue to protect and support people during this difficult time. And I think it's a reflection of when we feel vulnerable, we don't really talk about deficits. We don't talk about spending. That will be a debate I'm sure we will have in the months ahead. But right now it's about making sure that we can protect and support people who need it. And at the provincial level, this is local provincial populations' evaluations of their own governments. You can see across the country substantially high numbers. I've never seen this kind of positive impression. And it crosses political spectrum. If you're on the, if you're a liberal in Ontario, you even think Doug Ford's doing a good job. If you're a liberal in Quebec, you look at Francois Legault, whose numbers are incredibly positive. 97% of Quebecers think their government is doing well, or as well as can be expected on this issue, despite the fact, interestingly, that the numbers have been elevated in Quebec and more so than other parts of the country. In terms of political leadership, Mr. Trudeau, his numbers have remained fairly static and stable. 70% in our last survey saying they had confidence in his ability to make the right decisions. It wasn't long ago. In fact, I think I was talking about this when we were presenting some of the research with senators in Ottawa a few weeks ago, that Mr. Trudeau was a highly polarizing individual, and his popularity had been waning in the first few months of the year. We have seen a rallying around him. When it comes to public health officials like Dr. Tam, similarly, high levels of confidence in her ability, despite the fact there's been some debate about some of the advice she's given around face masks, for example. That has not had much impact. People look at her and they look at other provincial health officials, municipal health officials, and they feel comfort that people with experience and expertise are guiding decisions from the government. Some of the other big shifts we've seen in government and perspectives around government I find really interesting is we have been tracking public views around government for a number of years now. In the course of a month, we saw a 13-point increase in the number of people who said government provides good services that help make life better and more affordable for people. And that's in contrast to government's wasteful and inefficient. And I've never seen the number this high in all the years that I've done this. And so this doesn't mean it's going to stay this high, but it does reflect, I think, a moment where people who wouldn't otherwise feel good about what government can do, who wouldn't otherwise feel that government has the ability to positively impact their lives, are looking at what's going on and saying, I do see some benefit here. Similarly, And this is related to some of the work we did around the uncertainty and the role that cooperatives can play, and being that alternative business model. We see an 11-point increase in the belief that government regulation of business is necessary to protect the public interest. At the time when people are feeling vulnerable, when they feel they can be taken advantage of, when they feel powerless, government is an alternative to that. And we talked a lot in the study we did for CMC about this feeling of being in control, this need to feel that you're in control. Right now, a lot of Canadians don't feel they have much power, and so they do seek out organizations and models and structures that empower them and give them a sense of power. On a different note, as I mentioned, we also see a significant shift, not as big as some of the others, but still real from month to month, in the perception that expertise should guide public policy. We had seen a deterioration in this number over the last number of years as populist sentiment had grown. You'd seen, obviously the election of populist governments around the world, and this idea that people in positions of authority, people who have expertise, whether they be economists or physicians or business leaders or policymakers or scientists, weren't trusted as much and weren't viewed as being appropriate advisors to public policy. Well, maybe the COVID pandemic is going to spur on some of those changes going forward. And so these are some big shifts we're seeing in broad values and attitudes towards government. And we'll continue to track them to see if they persist beyond the moment right now. But many of you also are involved in organizations that are interacting directly with customers or consumers, or supply products to customers and servers. And so I wanted to share a little bit about what we're seeing around consumer behavior, because I think one of the most interesting things for me is, again, understanding that gap between feeling comfortable with doing something versus being able to do it. And we're going to enter a period where whether I feel comfortable getting on an airplane, whether I feel comfortable going to a mall, whether I feel comfortable going to a live concert or to a pub or a restaurant, will have will be different today than it was prior to March 16th. And so the question of what will change and what won't is really, I think, interesting and important as we try to anticipate how to react and serve customers in the future. A number of trends that I don't know if you noticed, but it's obviously in our data, and I'm feeling it day to day. We see big behaviors changing, right? So because we're stuck at home, because most restaurants that are still open only do takeout or delivery, you've got half of Canadians now saying they're cooking more than they ever did. And not only are they cooking more, when we ask them, do you think you're going to continue to cook more than you did before? A sizable group of this group says, yeah, I think I will, right? Because I've gotten used to it. I've learned maybe to like it. Maybe I don't love it, but I like it. And I've liked the control that it gives me. And I feel that I'm eating better, or I'm saving money. And so this is an example of how this period is forcing us to change. We have no choice, but might have a lasting effect going forward. We asked people in the most recent survey we did, imagine a world where there's no vaccine yet, right? But you're allowed to maybe have more freedom than we do now. Will you be doing more of the following? And we find that, again, 46% say they think they will continue to prepare more meals at home. 35% say they are more likely to avoid going to shopping malls, more likely to avoid crowded sporting events. So even if we do see government lift some of the restrictions, I'm not certain we're going to see a rush to shopping malls. If we don't have for example, a vaccine by Boxing Day. I don't know if Boxing Day 2020 will look like any Boxing Day we've ever seen. There may not be a mad rush to certain big box stores or malls like we typically see in the past. So these are all things that we're monitoring. In terms of things we may be doing less, I think if there's clear signals in our data that people will be traveling outside of Canada less than they usually would have. I think there's an opportunity for local destinations, local operators, to better to capture that tourism market, which right now is certainly on hold and frozen. But once people are free, I think there's going to be a real pent-up desire to try. I think in a lot of municipalities across the country, nobody is really riding public transit. There's big revenue shortfalls. I think that will persist as 35% of people who take public transit say, I may be doing this less than I usually do. And not surprising because of the financial impact, the impact on luxury items, whether that's cars or furniture or clothing or even food products, may take a hit because people have less money to spend on those kinds of things as a result of all of this. One of the big areas that I think was already being disrupted, and if you're in a retail business, you know this full well, is what this will do to bricks and mortar retail. And one of the things we wanted to test, and the way that we captured it, was we asked people, how often did you do this before COVID? And do you miss not being able to do it now? And so we were able to capture a sizable group of Canadians who, on a regular basis, go to a store to buy clothes, and ask them, well, now that you can't do it, do you miss it? Well, 1 out of 4 of them said that they don't miss going shopping for clothes in a bricks and mortar store, that they've found a way to replace that experience, whether obviously ordering online and maybe always believing that ordering clothes online didn't work, or the sizing never fits, or it's not easy to return. They may have learned in this period that it's not as difficult as they thought. So that's 2.4 million consumers who may now go to a mall less often, who might go to a retailer, the Bay or Walmart, less often to look for clothes than they might otherwise have done in the past. The same way, although we find an incredible amount of desire to get back into restaurants among those foodies who love the experience, 8% of those who regularly eat at restaurants are now saying, well, you know what, I don't miss it. And so for a restaurant or for any business, closing that gap between, missing it and needing it is going to be really important, because even though you don't miss it, you may still do it because it's convenient or because it's available or because it's there. And understanding that process, I think, is important. And so in my mind, the way I've been thinking—
a question, David?
Yes. Yes, Simone.
What percentage of Canadians didn't like clothes shopping before COVID-19?
Didn't like it?
Yeah.
It wasn't we didn't ask, it was whether you did it regularly or not. And I think, if I recall, I can find the number, but I think it was about 40% of Canadians said they did it at least a few times a month. So minority of people regularly went clothes shopping to begin with, but it's still a sizable number of people we're talking about. So back to this slide, and this is how I've been trying to organize my thoughts around how to measure the impact and how to think about the impact that COVID's going to have going forward on a range of businesses. And the way that I look at it is, you've got the pre-COVID levels of whatever it is you're interested in, consumption, behavior, sales, you name it, however that affects your business. And that once the pandemic began and legal restrictions came into place, much of that behavior shifted. And we've seen, depending on the sector, huge changes in sales and revenue across a lot of different sectors. Once those restrictions are lifted and we're free to return, the question that I'm left with wondering is, what makes people get there? How do we get back to a particular level? And in my mind, there's 4 things that I'm thinking about that guides the research that I'm doing with a number of my own clients right now. And that is, what are the health considerations that people are going to have? And this is particularly true in that moment, that period I talked about between being free and having a vaccine. The moment we have a vaccine and we're able to distribute it widely, I think we kind of get back to some form of new normal. But until then, and I've been listening to lots of podcasts trying to figure out, what's the likelihood of a vaccine happening. I think the one I recently heard was the vaccine for mumps took 4 years to find, right? So I'm not saying it's going to take that long for us to get a vaccine for COVID-19, but it's not going to likely happen in a short period of time, because even if they do find the vaccine, they need to make sure it works. They got to test it, and then they've got to mass produce it for billions of people around the world. So it is going to take some time. And so that health consideration becomes most important. Do I feel comfortable? Do I think it's too risky to be able to do certain types of behaviors? And how do retailers, how do businesses, how do financial institutions, credit unions respond to that and make the experience acceptable And if possible, how do you delight a customer in that kind of environment? I think reputation is going to matter more. The trust and the relationship that you have with your customers is going to speak volumes. The question of loyalty and brand loyalty, some have felt went out the window when we were in phase one and we were just trying to get any toilet paper we can, or any flour that we needed for baking, or any canned food. We didn't care what kind, as long as we could get it. Well, I think we're going to revert back to loyalty and trust in organizations and brands that we know well, that we know are committed and follow and say and do what they say they're going to do. And so understanding that, I think, is important. The third and fourth pieces are about what's new. What new habits have we formed in these weeks we've been stuck at home? And how has new forms of competition entered our lives that weren't there before? So in the case of telecom, if I've signed up to more streaming services, and I think yesterday Netflix announced that 16 million new people in the United States signed up for their streaming service over the last few weeks. Does that mean more of them will cut their cable subscription because now they no longer need it, or they've realized they don't need it? I haven't been able to watch sports, and the only news that's on is about COVID. What's on TV anymore, right? It may accelerate some of those shifts. And so it's to think about where new forms of competition comes into place. And that's how I'm thinking about it. So I want to end, though, by coming back to really where we started. And for those of you on the webinar who saw me do a webinar a few months ago, or were at a talk I did at a Congress, I think last year, I was talking about the role that cooperatives and mutuals play in a world that's increasingly uncertain to more people. And this was all done in the context before COVID. But I reflect back, and I think that the work we did, and if you haven't seen that report, I know Simone will send links and copies of where you can find it on CMC's website. But what that study found—
in the chat box.
It's in the chat box. What that study found was that Canadians, some Canadians, not all, are familiar with cooperatives and mutuals. Those who aren't, when they're told about the model, when they're told about the approach to running a business, to serving a community, to how things are run, they find real appeal there. And so I think there's an opportunity here for the entire sector at a moment where there's going to be an opportunity to reset so much of the world, right? To demonstrate once again, I hope, that co-ops are more resilient than other forms of business, that by working together, you can help more people and you can stay in business. There's going to be another story to be told at the end of this. And when I'll just share one data point from our survey, and this was before COVID, when we asked Canadians at the end of our survey, do you think Canada would be better with more cooperatives? We found that half said yes, a quarter weren't sure, and only 5% said the country would be worse. This is, I think, a real opportunity to continue to tell the cooperative story, to tell why it is cooperatives are strong, resilient, vibrant, community-focused. And at a moment where people are feeling insecure, they're feeling vulnerable, and certainly uncertain, I do think that, as I've said many times, and I'll continue to say, this is an opportunity for cooperatives to really shine. So I encourage you to look at that past report, and I'm happy to, in the future, take any questions you have. But I want to end with just 4 final points. And that really is, in my mind, 2 factors remain important to understanding what's going on. The first is that until we have a vaccine, the uncertainty will continue to exist. And this new normal, whatever that new normal looks like, won't happen. But second is, we still don't quite understand the true economic impact that this is going to have on our country and on the world, and whether we're going to see a move towards more nationalism as opposed to globalization, whether we're going to see a move to more local resiliency as opposed to a more interconnected supply chain. There's lots of big questions, I think, that remain depending on the impact of this. But to me, I think we're likely going to see shifting attitudes around the role of government, shifting views around the role of work. And I think you're going to find that as a result of both financial pressures on households and this period where so much of our world has had to change. You're going to see some new behaviors and new habits form that we need to better understand. And all businesses, whether cooperative or not, whether in financial services or retail or in manufacturing or in housing or you name it, are going to have to respond to. So I will end there, and I think we have a little bit of time, and I'm happy to go over the 2:30 mark if there's any questions right now. Over to you, Simone.
Okay, so you can ask your questions in the chat or use the question and answer box. Or I think all mics are still muted, so you can ask your questions in the Q&A or chat. N'hésitez pas à vous poser vos questions en français. L'interprète peut les traduire en anglais. Are boomers looking at this differently than the new generation? Une question de Claude Gauthier.
Good question. I think it's still too early to have a good read on that in terms of most people don't yet know what the true impact is. But I suspect, I think this is hitting everybody. Phase one was hit everybody in the same way. But if I'm going to hypothesize what the impact is on boomers in particular, I do think that this was a moment when many of them, and I think of my own parents as an example, felt quite vulnerable and that their own health was at risk. And I do suspect we're going to see more, perhaps a move to maybe earlier retirement than people thought, or some kind of flexible version. On the other hand, if people have been financially hurt by this, you might see an extension of their careers a little bit longer than we might have otherwise seen. For younger generations, I think of my millennials, this will be the second in many of their lifetimes substantial financial or economic impact. And so the impact of that, I think, will really need to be measured and understood, because this will be the second time for, if you're in your early 30s, you were affected by the 2008 recession, and now you may be more in your career, but it may have a big impact there. But I think it's still too early to understand the full psychology, but it's one of the areas I'm going to definitely explore very closely.
So a question from Denise Guy. Are there any particular sectors that co-ops would flourish?
Well, I do think, I think financial services will be one to watch. I think, although banks right now have been instrumental in helping deliver many of, particularly for small businesses, the programs that the government is funneling through, that the way that the banks are treating their customers when it comes to credit card rates or deferrals of mortgage payments, those kinds of things might be an opportunity, particularly for credit unions and Caisse Populaires to make an appeal. Otherwise, I don't think there's an obvious example in my mind. But I do think that, the question around housing and housing affordability has always been there. And so perhaps for cooperative housing, there's an opportunity here to continue to make the case that, many people may be displaced or looking for alternatives to the housing they have now. And I think the cooperative housing model could be something that does flourish in a post-COVID world as well.
Thank you. A question from Eric Tusking. What implications are you seeing from nonprofit or charitable organization cooperatives?
I don't know if a specific answer to that, Eric. I think we're seeing right now still a lot of uncertainty around a lot of charitable organizations around how people are going to react. And I don't know if you're thinking about it from the perspective of how individuals will they continue to give? Will they engage with charities? I don't know, but I do see for those that haven't been affected, one of the things I've been thinking about is we focused a lot, as we should, on, say, the 30% of the population who's had a huge economic disruption because of this. There's another significant group who haven't. And I've actually spent the last 6 weeks doing very little and, canceling trips and plans in which they were going to spend a sizable amount of money. So there is going to be an opportunity among a large portion of the consumer group who have maybe a little more disposable income than they might have otherwise had. And how do you engage them and have a conversation about how they can help those who need help, I think is going to be the next stage of it. I see evidence of it all over my own community here in Ottawa, fundraisers for the food bank and supporting local organizations. That drive to support local, while it's not specific to your question, I think will be one factor, one possible trend that we see coming out of this, that the recognition that if I don't have strong local businesses, many of them could be co-ops, then that's not a good thing for the resiliency of my community.
So 3 more questions. First of all, from Courtney. Thank you. Can you speak more about the gender divide? I'm wondering if that's mostly because of a lack of childcare options, and childcare typically falls more on women's shoulders. And then I have 2 more questions.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by that. And I admit, and I have to admit, that I'm not the expert on being able to understand it. So I've done some reading and some research trying to unpack why we see this consistent difference in views on this, and concern and worry and the reported emotional impact that women are feeling versus men. And the evidence that I've seen points to a number of factors, one of them being the responsibility for child care and raising and sort of caring for children that women typically take on. Part of it appears to be genetic in the sense that there's something about the psychology of women that makes them more worried, and men a little bit easier to just sort of not worry about it. But whatever's causing it, in my mind, the way I look at it is we need to have organizations need to be ready to solve for it and serve, I think, genders in different ways, because they are reacting different to this issue. And it's too easy even to say men and women are different and we need to treat men and women differently. I think one of the things I've learned in doing research is we look for patterns in the data, but even then, there's a lot of men who are struggling through this, and there are a lot of women who aren't. And understanding what's driving each individual, while difficult, I think is something we need to keep perspective on as well.
So, questions are coming in. Any information about future services for older people and the model of long-term care or seniors' home, changes more services at home, etc.?
Well, I think we asked the question, at the very least, at the end of this, there will be a deep and profound discussion about the quality of our long-term care for seniors. I think there's no doubt about that. And so that will create, I think, an interesting discussion about alternatives and what we as a society and what we as individuals are willing to do to help and care for our aging population, because in fact, Canada is aging anyways. And we're going to have that issue is going to be even greater 20 years from now than it is today. And so I think that this whole unfortunate episode will create the impetus to do that. And I think we're going to see that conversation happen.
So one question from Alain Blanchette: how collective enrichment and the sharing of wealth are perceived?
I think I don't know if that has changed. I think there's different perspectives on it. One of the things I'm left wondering is whether the isolation we've all felt. I mean, I'll just give you a personal story. I live on a small street in Ottawa, and we've got 7 neighbors who at 6:30 every night we come out and we clang, pots and pans, and we make noise in celebrating frontline workers who are coming off the shift. And we have been a fairly close neighborhood, but this has brought us together. and I don't know if this is what you mean, Alan, about like collective enrichment, but I do think this has created a desire for people. While we may live more digital lives after this because we got used to it, I don't think we can replace the feeling that we get when we're with people and we're connecting with people in real time and personally, physically together. So I do think that we may see a shift or a deep demand or desire for more of that. In terms of sharing of wealth, I do think that one of the things, and I talk about the role of government a little bit, I do think that we may see a much more openness to more collectivism coming out of this, that by helping everybody, by doing it together, it costs less and it's more effective. That could be a consequence, but I still think it's too early to know.
Do you see a divide in serving our existing co-op members in the future opposed to attacking and serving new members? That's Ian Ripley.
Can you say that one again, Simone?
Yes, certainly. Do you see a divide in serving our existing co-op members in the future opposed to attracting and serving new members? I
think it obviously depends on your cooperative and who your current membership is and who the membership is you want to attract. But I don't think there's a difference, and maybe I'm not understanding the intention of the question, but I think the effects of this will be unique depending on someone's personal situation, their employment, their age. There's a lot of factors, but I think the psychological effect will probably be similar across the board. And so how you serve a member and what your value proposition is for that current member versus the prospective member, I think may change, but the reaction to it won't. So I'm not sure there's much difference. I think what works for current members may work for new members unless there's a generational divide or something that requires you to change the way you do it. But in my mind, the value system is still going to be the same.
Okay, I have a question in French, but I'll try to, from Colette. She is surprised that there's 62% of the 18 to 29 that are feeling lonely because of this confinement. It's a lot bigger than the other age groups. How do you explain that? And Colette would have thought that they would be satisfied because they're already used to virtual relationships. How can we better give them the tools they need to feel less? It's not really a good translation, but I think you understand.
I do.
How can we explain that?
So first off, I do think you're right. It seems like a contradiction, right? Younger people are most lonely in an environment where they're relying more on digital communication to connect with people. But I think this is where we have a misunderstanding of what those tools like our phones and the internet actually mean, right? So while we may be much more reliant on them, and I always hear stories when I do my talks about millennials. I get parents who always come up to me and say, I don't understand my kids. They're sitting on the couch with their friends talking to each other on their phones. They're not actually talking. They're just texting each other. What gives? Now that's just the mode in which they communicate. But I still think that what the research I've done is younger people still crave sensory experiences. And in fact, they're more likely to crave them because their lives have typically been so tied to their phone. And so the inability to go to a restaurant, the inability to go to to see a live show at a bar or a pub or in a park, the ability just to see friends, and the fact that younger people are typically more likely to live alone or to be alone in their parents' home. So even if they're with other people, they still feel alone because they don't have somebody who's like them or their age to be around. And so I do think that it makes sense to me when you actually unpack that. What to do about it? In the short term, I'm not sure there's much. I think it's about because I think we're missing that physical interaction. But longer term, I think once we're let free, you're going to see, like we already see it in some of the research, there's this pent up desire to get back in the world and experience things again. And I think you're going to see a lot of people wanting to do that as quickly as they can.
Okay, before COVID-19, people traveled long distances to work and stayed in work lodges or temporary accommodations. Do you think there will be a change in where people are willing to go to work?
Oh, that's a great question. I think to some extent, yes. I think on the other hand, at least in the short to medium term, the economic impact of this may create more impetus for people to find work. And so it will be balancing this need for an income and their concern about safety. And so I think it's going to raise standards on a lot of these. I think of, the stories that are coming out of Alberta around meat processing plants or camps up in northern Alberta at the oil sands. There are going to be new standards in place that people are going to expect. And so I also think that you're going to see far less business travel because you now have so many people doing exactly what we're doing today, meeting people from across the country and feeling that while it's not the same as meeting somebody in person, do I really need to fly to Vancouver to have a 3-hour meeting? On top of it, I'm concerned about climate change. Maybe I shouldn't do that in the first place, but now I know I can have a meaningful, productive conversation with people. So I do think there will be long-lasting implications on work. I also think, as I mentioned to in my presentation, I run a business. All my team members, except for one, are under the age of 34 now, I think, except for me. And I have no problem with them, interacting and working from home every few days or whenever they feel like it. I think you're going to see far more flexible workplaces. I think you're going to see employers who are going to start downsizing their physical footprints, recognizing that maybe every employee doesn't have to come into the office if it's office-based work every single day. And so instead of having 10,000 square feet, I can shrink to 5,000, have more common spaces, and move to a more efficient model. So I think one sector that's certainly going to see a long-term, impact will be commercial real estate, where you now have a lot of businesses rethinking that need for lots of physical space for their team members.
So we have a comment and a question from Senator Lucie Moncion. The comment is, financial co-ops are on board with the government programs. They monitor delinquency, have measured approaches to business sustainability, reduced interest rate and credit cards, and provide $3,000 loans for immediate cash flow problems. And her question is, you spoke of the recovery period, which will depend on the length of the pandemic. You also spoke of the economic impact on individuals. How do you think the cooperative sector will be impacted?
Well, I think it depends what part of this, what sector you're in. I think, retail, there is, I think grocery is doing okay right now, but other retail could be affected by this. You're going to see, I think, if co-ops are not ready for e-commerce and some of the, I think that the increasing demand that people will have for more, delivery-based shopping and stuff like that, I think that's going to be one reaction. On the other hand, I think that we know this from history that co-ops are typically more resilient to these kind of external threats. And so, planning for long-term, being sustainable, looking out for not just, the short term, but the longer term, I think will serve co-ops generally much better than other businesses. And so in that way, certainly I think it's going to have an impact. I can think of, Mountain Equipment Co-op as being one that already was having troubles with the shift to digital. This is going to probably expedite that move. But others, I think will come out probably stronger. My advice to all businesses is to use this opportunity to be as positive as you can, first of all, but also to reflect on your own business and really focus hard on where, as Wayne Gretzky said, the puck is going, because I think this will accelerate things that were already going to happen. And so if you're a cooperative that has been proactive and has seen where the market's moving, you're going to be fine. If you've been a little slower to adapt and respond, that's where I think this is going to be more impetus to accelerate some of those things that you may be thinking about.
Excellent. Seeing there are no more questions and we lost a few participants, we could conclude this meeting. Thank you very much, David. I encourage all the participants to go to our COVID-19 CMC page. I will give you the link when I send you the recording link. I invite you to give us information. We have an events page, so if you're doing webinars that you think are open to a much larger network, we can put our network to your we can open it up to your network. CMC will be soon getting out a letter to all parliamentarians. We will showcase health co-ops, how co-ops help local achat local, so local buying, and how co-ops are champions of community and rural development, among other things. This letter will make the point that co-ops have to be thought as a champion for the economic recovery. So thank you, David, again. We are looking forward to having the recording link, and we will send it this afternoon or early tomorrow morning to all people who have registered. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
And,